Well, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the latest in our series of webcasts. We're delighted to be talking to you today about purchase to pay or source to pay, and this interesting title, Bad Buying and Poor Paying. We're talking about the end-to-end purchase to pay challenges, which I'm sure you're all deeply involved in. My name's Dan French. I'm the guy on the left, and the remarkably good-looking man on the right is Phil Spence, who's European Business Process Owner for Purchase to Pay at LKQ Corporation. Welcome, Phil.
Thank you very much.
And we are going to be talking about this topic. I want to be conscious of your time. We're going to try and keep it at 30 minutes. It may dip over to 35. I want to talk a little bit about the challenge. I want to talk a little bit about why spend and buying and good or bad buying and good or bad paying is such a critical element of working capital right now, and why it's so important right now. And Phil's going to talk a little bit about P2P and the perceptions we are challenged with, and how to create a new reality. So we're looking forward to Phil's experiences. And then we're going to kind of have some food for thought about what we might do about that in how we address process change, automation, transformation, P2P. And then we're going to have a Q&A session. So please do ask your questions as you go through. When the ideas come to your mind, pop them in the interface on GoToWebinar. There's a little question and answer panel. Pop the questions in, and then we'll have a nice selection to deal with at the end. For those who don't have time to address directly, we'll deal with by email, so you won't be forgotten. But it makes it, it helps you, it helps us. So please ask your questions as you go. And if you have any technical problems with the service, please enter into a question in the same panel, and one of our team will try and help you out. So that's what we're talking about. So let's move straight into the topic. I mean, it's no surprise to anyone, we're in an interesting economic time, right? So cash and working capital are moving to center stage, and it's just important to realize, or to remember maybe, that spend and what we pay out is a critical element of the working capital equation, right? So that accounts payable and other current debts, really, really important. So, if you're involved in the purchase to pay cycle of any type, in any area of that cycle, there's never been a more important time to get focused on how to optimize it. So I guess that's good news. And when we talk to organizations around the world about why, people are always talking about transformation and the drive for digital transformation. And in source to pay and purchase to pay, we always ask people, what are the key business drivers? And what's interesting is it always falls into these six options, and usually companies have one or two at any point in time, and obviously they're all good things, but there's usually a focus on one or two. And just to allow you to think through where your own organization is, they typically under reducing effort and cost of process operation. It's a classic efficiency, elimination of unnecessary tasks, optimizing working capital. How do we make sure that our P2P process is driving towards our working capital goals? Managing risk, both supplier risk and risk of and financial risk. Reducing maverick spend, so making sure that we know we can forecast what we're spending and we've got requests and POs for it all. Reducing the cycle time of the process itself, which has a massive relationship to the pay on time metric. So how do we make buying simple for ourselves and our suppliers? And how do we reduce the cost of goods and services? Now, that last one is obviously the classic mandate of sourcing and procurement, but it's a key part of the end-to-end cycle. So it's interesting. I would challenge you probably that when you're talking to your colleagues and executives and internal customers, to put that chart up and say, which ones do we care most about right now? Which ones are our priority focus? And don't say all of them, because by definition, that means there aren't any priorities. So that's great, but we hear, it's always been the same, but there's a clamor for, well, if we digitize it, if we do this kind of technology, that'll solve our problems. And it's a very, very appealing claim, very, very appealing claim, and definitely the technologies have a lot to add. But you got to remember that I think this is a McKinsey, as I recall, it's a McKinsey statistic. 70% of digital transformations don't deliver the value projected at kickoff. Well, I tell you, it's a lot worse than that. It's probably more like 90%. And that's not to say they're all abject failures. What it is to say is that when you look at a business case, you say we're going to save this amount of money over this period of time. And what we tend to find is we're over optimistic both on the amount, the business outcomes, the savings or revenue increases we're going to make, and we're over optimistic about the cycle time, the time within which we're going to make it. So on both counts, we fail, which is why that number's so high, because very rarely do we meet it all. So that's worth bearing in mind. So be very cautious about the expectations you set when you're in the business case stage. Now, I love this quote. It's a Bill Gates quote, but to me, it absolutely epitomizes the rule of any transformation, any digitization. Any technology that applies to an efficient operation will magnify the efficiency. Any automation applied to inefficient operation will magnify the inefficiency. That says everything you need to know. And if you need any support in that, I was reading recently, A.T. Kearney produced a very helpful technology stack for procurement. Obviously, the left-hand side of the source and procure the pay cycle. Now, that would scare the living daylights out of anybody. And that's before you know what problem you've got. So I don't know what problem I've got, but that's a stack. So bear that in mind. And the real issue that we're all facing is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? And what is the process? What elements of the process are trying to optimize? And when we talk to our colleagues, our stakeholders, and our leadership, when we all bandy around the word business process, end-to-end process, global process, these phrases, and everyone nods, so we assume everyone has got the same understanding, but it's not true. And I guarantee you, if you ask 10 colleagues to define what they mean by process, you get 11 different answers. So I'm not going to read this for you. You can work it out yourself. But typically, you get these answers at the top, the sequence of steps you go through SAP or Oracle or whatever. But it's much more nuanced than that. It's about habits and behaviors. How do we do all the things we need to do to approve and control and execute? How do we produce an outcome for the customer? What's the, is it direct or indirect value? And it's as much about the experience. The process is as much about how it feels to me as a participant in it as it does about the mechanics. And that's something we miss a lot of. So that's just worth thinking about. Now, it's, all these things seem obvious. It's obvious what our problems are in purchase to pay. But the reality is the problems you see out the top of the iceberg are just small. Well, they're not small, but they're symptoms of much bigger issues below the waterline. And I love this iceberg image, and it applies to so many things. But it's kind of a metaphor also for the Dunning-Kruger effect. So any of you who've listened to me talk about anything in the past will know that I'm fixated on cognitive biases, because smart people tend to trip over their own shoelaces by a lot of cognitive biases, and we're all smart people. And this is these psychologists 20 years ago, they did this assessment, did this analysis, and they worked out that when intelligent people are faced with a decision, a problem, an opinion to form, they are massively confident about things they have no knowledge about, which kind of seems vaguely amusing, but it's true. If you think about it yourself, it's true. We all do that. So this massive confidence on the left-hand side of this chart. If you have the misfortune to actually have to implement that decision, that recommendation, that opinion, you suddenly realize, actually, this is far more complicated than I thought. It's far more nuanced. There's much more challenges. We overestimated it. Or underestimated it. It's too simplistic. And if you're fortunate enough to become a subject matter expert and actually go through this cycle a few times, you do get a level of confidence. But the irony is, it's never as much confidence as you had at the beginning as a naive optimist, right? And that is just crazy, but it's true. So this is one of the reasons why we do these webcasts, because a lot of this is about trying to break down that cognitive bias, trying to make sure we recognize the complexity of life. So a parallel to that is complex problems tend to have complex answers, but we are fed lots of simple answers to complex problems. And that's why the big line on the left is pretty busy. But this road less traveled on the right is something you want to pay attention to. And on that basis, we're very pleased to have Phil Spence with us today, who is, he's walking down that path and making a lot of progress, and is going to share some of his experiences with you. So welcome, Phil.
Dan, thanks ever so much for that introduction. It's very kind of you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining and giving up time to listen through this tale. When Dan and I first spoke, I was trying to think, how do we position this? And the perception versus reality felt like a good starting point. And what I mean by that, if we look at accounts payable, not paying a vendor invoice could be the perception. But the reality perhaps more akin to an AP department not being able to pay the vendor invoice. And as we start peeling back the layers of the onion, we start then touching master data management, the accuracy of it, the accuracy of forecasting for demand. Are we buying what's needed versus buying what's commercially beneficial to us or perceived as being commercially beneficial to us? Payment terms is always a great one. Are we paying and enforcing standard payment terms, or are we negotiating individual deals ad hoc basis? And all of that hiving up into how as an organization we're managing our supplier relationship, ensuring that we're not juggling the symptoms or managing the symptoms, but instead we're identifying and addressing the root causes. So LKQ, who are we? We are Fortune 500. We turn over 13 billion, and we are a provider of automotive aftermarket parts. We've grown from $0 to where we are today in 25 years, so we're still quite a new organization. Within the European geography, we're even younger. 15 years ago, we had a $0 footprint. We now turn over $6.5 billion. And that was essentially driven through various acquisitions that have been taking place over the last 15 years. From an IT infrastructure perspective, we're quite complex. We have over 21 ERPs. We're in over 20 countries in Europe. So we're quite fragmented. We have fragmented ways of working. We have fragmented processes, different cultures, different behaviors, and different habits. And the way in which I think about it is we've got all of the challenges of a new business with all of the challenges of a long, well-established business. Our Stargruber business in Germany, for instance, recently celebrated its 100-year anniversary. So what is it that we were looking to try and solve? Well, as many of these journeys often start, we were starting with an ERP rollout. We have a huge estate, and we wanted to have one common ERP platform across all of our European countries. We have disparate business units that are operating autonomously. We wanted to hive up to create a one LKQ Europe to really drive efficiencies and deliver post-acquisition benefits. We needed to look at standardization versus localization. Were we doing things because that's always the way in which we've done it, or were we doing it for legal or statutory reasons within that geography? And we tried to apply that logic across 9 core processes across our business. So what we did as we entered the initial ERP rollout, we very quickly identified that we were going on a path that was going to lead us with 21 ERPs, as we did not address the localization and harmonize a standard approach. We needed to challenge the as-is ways of working with the operations. We needed to essentially pull a blueprint together at the European level and articulate to our regions how we wished them to work, but in such a way that it wasn't dictatorial. It was socialized. It won over hearts and minds of the regions, and the regions felt part of the process and were brought along on the journey. It's quite an important piece when we look at the exception and the acceptance and the adoption of change. We also recognize that with the fragmented nature of the organization that we'd acquired, we had varying levels of maturity. So we decided, or we defined, that we should have business basics. And I'll come on to that in a little bit in the next slide or two. But also recognizing that the different disciplines have different requirements. The requirements of indirect is very different to the requirements of direct. So we set out with some initial design principles. We stood up a European business process owner organization, and that function is 12 months old now. We identified the need to almost shadow that structure at the regional level, where we were able to bring in regional experts for the processes. And we needed to ensure that we looked at the entire end-to-end of procure to pay, as opposed to looking at what historically have been siloed functions. The business basics, that was the base level, non-negotiable expectations that we had from any region. We had some operative design principles as well. So there are going to be parallel processes that drive some prerequisites for the procure to pay process to be effective. Correctness of inbound purchase requisitions, for one, being critical to the success of the process. Another operative objective was trying to limit the localized spend. We wanted to leverage our scale as a European entity, so we wanted to try and migrate to European contracts and European ways of working. Strategic principles. I heard years ago the phrase lights out processing, and it really resonated with me. And, if you're going to touch it just once, but ideally not touch it at all. And we had that as a strategic principle that we wanted to try and garner that level of efficiency. And most importantly, ensure item availability. We wanted to make sure that when our customers came to us, we had that item on the shelf ready to sell to them. So where are we currently? If we look at results to date, this is using that playbook at one of the legacy businesses. And we've seen straight through processing defined as touchless invoice receipt to invoice payment. We were able to move that STP from 18% to a high of 73% and to an average run rate of between 66 and 68%. And that increase in STP allowed a reduction in headcount of over 50%. And I call this out that none of that achievement was through the adoption of new technology. That was looking at people, process, and master data, and ensuring that we were very clean on that and drove that better way of working to achieve those results. So, how are we doing it? So, 10 months ago, we stood up. 10, 12 months ago, we stood up the business process organization. We had a small team of experts at the European level. So I'm talking about 5 or 6 people here. We kept it quite small. We agreed those high-level guiding design principles that would underpin the process that we were going to design. And we started with a clean piece of paper. We were system agnostic. We didn't let the system drive the process. We didn't bend the process because of system capabilities or indeed limitations. We looked at what should we be doing? How should we be working? How do we get the end result of efficiency in accounts payable, and how do we drive that through the earlier part of the procure to pay work stream? Once we've got that initial draft at a European level agreed and bought into by the European exec, we then used that shadow team that we stood up in the regions, and we socialized that process map with them. Very open and very candid to take feedback and understand whether things had been omitted from a European level that needed consideration, or was the localization really just localization on ways in which things had always worked. The example I've used in the past is Slovakian tax law. I don't know Slovakian tax law, but we find out who does know Slovakian tax law. We make sure that if our process needs to bend because of it, we take that on. Otherwise, we change the ways of working. As you can imagine, that was quite some task to go through essentially 5 regions and review that. It's iterative, so the first region saw the first step, which was slightly different by the time we came to the 5th region. So after that process, we had a complete alignment with all regions to make sure that as the iterative stages of the process evolved and developed, that didn't negatively impact any of the regions that had seen the process prior to it. And what that allowed us to do was at the European level, say we have a pan-European procure-to-pay process that all regions are aligned to and prepared to execute against. So now we've got it, it's about now identifying the the pilots as to how this can then be implemented at both the regional and the European level. Challenges, so people are always the greatest asset. So identifying the right people and getting those people into the positions that they could support this initiative was hugely important. And when we talk about the right people, it's making sure that not only do they have the knowledge of what needs to be understood or debated, but also the acceptance that a way of working needs to change, and that they're open and prepared to give that consideration. Not wholeheartedly bend, debate. Positive friction is how I've heard it called. It is a good thing. So making sure that they're prepared to debate things, but do have that cognitive acceptance that change is coming. Across 21 countries, you can imagine language is a challenge, but also terminology. One thing in one region means something very different in another. So ensuring that when we're talking through specific detailed steps, that our terminology, our acronyms are very, very clear and very clearly understood by all in attendance. The other thing is expectation management, and it's quite empowering when you get a group of people and you're all enthused about changing the world, but you can't change the world overnight. It's not a light switch. So managing the expectation that this is a long journey and it's not a light switch. We can't flick a switch and all of these changes in process, changes in ways of working will take effect. Also challenging was the conflict and polarization of views. When someone's been doing something for a certain way for a certain period of time, trying to convince them that there is a different way or a better way is not always easy. And particularly within procure to pay, there are not always one defined way of doing something. The one that immediately comes to mind is something like full or partial ASN receipting. So making sure that the environment that's created during the workshop is such that everyone can have their voice heard and their opinions sought. By doing that, the best ideas come to fruition. Really, that then drives into the hearts and minds of people, that they feel part of the journey, they feel part of the design, they've contributed and emotionally invested in what it is that's being pulled together. And the other challenge is just that continued drive for change. There's always something that can be improved upon. There's always something that you can do better. And if you get that instilled within people, that'll really drive, as long as you also recognize along the way the wins that you've achieved. It's a good balance between having that hunger and having that reward for success. What would I do differently? I'd love to have spent more time in all of the countries with the local teams and the local management teams, and spend a lot more time physically touching processes as opposed to doing it through the medium of a workshop. But the path that we were on didn't necessarily permit that from a time perspective. But that's certainly one that I'd call out for anyone on a similar journey. And similarly, afford myself more time. Trying to do this in the timeframes we've been looking at has been quite a challenge when you're trying to juggle, the demanding work job and the home life as well. So that would be one that I'd call out too. In terms of a playbook, approach your end-to-end process with that clean sheet of paper, that clean mind. Don't think about the process is dependent upon this technology, or we can only do this because the technologies will allow us to do that. Try and park that for the time being and define what your process template should look like. Really, I can't overemphasize that in my view. Your stakeholder engagement is critical as well. People need to buy into what you're doing, accept why you're doing it, and understand the rationale behind it, and support it. Because when you're looking at a procure to pay work stream, that's quite a large work stream. It's got a lot of stakeholders, and you need to bring them all along with you. And of course, your supplier is a critical stakeholder within that process.
Well, thanks, Phil. That's a great talk through your experience and some of the challenges and some of the lessons learned. So I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. We're going to come back to some of that. Now, I'm sure you got questions on some of what Phil spoke about. So please pop your questions in the interface. It's good for you and it's good for us. So please get your questions in there. And we're going to talk now a little bit about this whole issue. You know, as Phil's indicated, we know that the paying side of the cycle is directly dependent on the buying side of the cycle. So that's why we call it bad buying, poor paying. What can we learn from Phil's experiences and the more broader challenge about process change, automation, transformation, P2P? Now, first thing I'd love to draw your attention to is this guy, Peter Smith. It wrote an amazing book. I read it on my holidays last year, which might tell you what a sad person I am. I didn't actually read it. I was on an audio book. So I made it look like I was just lying by the pool, but I was actually listening to something. And this book, Bad Buying, which is obviously where we got part of the name of this webcast from. Now, Peter Smith is a former procurement executive at Mars, at NatWest Bank, at Dun & Bradstreet. He's the past president of the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. He's got a host of experience on the left-hand side of the process. And without giving any away, I would encourage you to read it or listen to it, because if you're involved in any part of P2P, this is relevant to you, because he talks about the challenges around sourcing and procurement. And as you look at the little chart there, sourcing and procurement is what drives the right-hand side. So I think it's a really important point. And we know there are challenges up and down these cycles. But when we look at end-to-end processes, and Phil talked about that, it's reasonable to ask, why do we care about end-to-end? I've had a few conversations like, how does it really matter? And if you look at other parts of industry, and if you look certainly at manufacturing and the auto industry, they cracked the issue of end-to-end processes like decades ago. In fact, before most of us were born, they solved the problem of realizing operating in silos is massively wasteful. It has cost waste, it has inventory waste, it has waste, it has every sort of waste. And the challenges are more significant in each of the silos. So think about those silos maybe as the demand, the sourcing, the buying, the paying. You know, if you try to optimize any one of them, those efficiencies might look important to you when you're in the silo, but in the end-to-end cycle, they make marginal difference, which is what they found in the automotive industry. Performance measures get misaligned because everyone in the silo has their own performance measures. The customer really doesn't see any value out of it, and the whole outcome isn't great. So, you know, if you're in any doubt about why you need to look at P2P or source to pay as an end-to-end, just look at every other, what I'd call the physical processes, manufacturing, for example, and us in softer processes, we're a bit late to the party. So there's a lot we can learn from this. And one of the key issues, and it kind of relates a little bit to what we talked before, one of the challenges with an end-to-end process is you have to ask the question for anything, what does good look like? And it's the hardest question in any business, whether you're talking at a process, at a department, or across the organization. It sounds like it should be easy, but it isn't. It's the hardest question in business, and it takes some real thought, and it's basically a balanced scorecard of various things. So the image at the bottom is meant to imply, well, it is two different lighthouses entering a harbor. And if you think about that in source to pay as sourcing and procurement on the left and finance and accounts payable on the right, and if you ask both of those groups, what does good look like for them on purchase to pay, they give you top three, they give you three different answers. And that's not, and both of them are right. But the problem is when you're trying to do an end-to-end cycle, you've got to harmonize them. You've got to get a common picture, otherwise you end up with a mess. So, you know, this is a really critical thing, and I encourage you all to spend more time on what does good look like for your process than is currently spent on it. And the other piece, and this relates to when we said earlier, 70 or 90% of digital transformations fail. The primary reason, in fact, there's two primary reasons. One is nobody works out what good looks like properly, because it's a very hard question. And the second one is end-to-end processes, whether it's purchase to pay, order to cash, or anything else, there isn't one journey through it. There are a number of valid, desirable journeys based on the category of what you're doing. And here's an example for source to pay, purchase to pay. You've got direct spend and indirect spend, PO-based, non-PO, and the rest of it. And it's important to recognize those, because people often make the mistake of assuming there's only one journey, applying technology to it, and realizing they missed out 85% of the volume. So when you work out your journeys, then you need to map those journeys in some detail. There's a template here. I encourage you to use it. You can ask for it, you can use it, fill in your own world for it. But for every journey, you want to be very clear on what each steps, what's the objectives, what's the work, who's accountable, what's the execution, what the defects and waste, and what the risks. And that helps you really, really get a better picture of what you're trying to improve. And as Phil kind of intimated earlier, there's kind of a hierarchy here of what are the key foundations of process success. And frankly, there's a corollary here for most processes, but for purchase to pay, vendor master data is absolutely the foundation. If your vendor master data, if you have any doubt about it, focus on that first, because everything else is going to be pointless. Then the purchase request to PO journey is a critical point, because that's another foundational element. Supplier engagement, Phil talked about. The goods receipt and invoice to pay cycle. And then icing on the cake is contracts and contract management. Are we getting the best of our contracts? But you're not going to solve that top problem if you haven't got the other four cracked. So it's a really healthy but simple little image here to work through. So for those of you in the shared service environment or accounts payable, we tend to, that's the right-hand side, so what we call settlement, which is payables and reconciliation. The left-hand side is demand and sourcing. The middle bit is the buying, contracting, purchase request, purchase order, fulfillment, goods receipting. A lot of stakeholders, right? But we know that 95% of the issues, if you're involved in the accounts payable side of it, 95% of the issues are caused to the left. And that's because we've got silos, right? So we've got to crack that issue. So that's worth thinking about. Now, that kind of idea of if we're going to be successful in our endeavors to optimize processes and operate effectively, then we've got to be able to shift left. We've got to be able to communicate and engage effectively with the people on the left-hand side. And I think people always nod and say, yeah, that's easy to do, but it's not. It's very hard. And there's a very cartoon-like example of why it's hard. And that's because what you think is obvious, your business partner up or down the life cycle doesn't. And that's the first thing. We've got to get some clarity on what we mean and what those differences of opinion are. And then we need to earn the right to do that. And that trust equation, there's a great book here by Charles Green and David Mesa. And it's worth reading the book. But the critical piece, he talks about a trust equation, which we always talk about trust in business, but nobody really defines it. And I like this. He describes trustworthiness. If you're going to be able to operate up and down an end-to-end process stream, you've got to demonstrate credibility in the process. You've got to demonstrate you know what you're talking about. So you've got to do some research and learn. You've got to demonstrate reliability, which is you say what you do and do what you say all the time. And you've got to have some intimacy, some understanding, some personal engagement. But the big thing that undermines all of this is self-interest. So if you're very obviously self-interested in your own organization unit, your own team, that destroys everything else. So it really is quite a challenge to be able to do this well. So ultimately, this is it's not just an IQ challenge, the detail to the abstract, be able to do all that, that's hard enough. But add some real EQ to this process and to this approach is critical. And I think that's what Phil was describing. So in summary, I'd just say, we all hope for a silver bullet. We hope that maybe AI will solve the problem. It won't. It might help in certain areas, but there is no silver bullet here. And this is a statement made by a Nobel Prize winning surgeon, but it's absolutely true in the world we all operate in. It's all about getting 100 small steps to go right, one after the other, no slip-ups, everyone pitching in. That's a reality, right? So that's that's where I want to finish off. That's what we've talked through. I do want to take your questions. I know some of you asked some questions. So, and I would also like to say that the conversation with Phil has been very, very engaging. And I think, if we want to continue that conversation, drop us a note and maybe we can put some more conversational interaction together. But we've got some Q&A. So keep your questions coming. We've got time for a couple. I know we're a little bit over a couple of these. So, so here's a question. So how long do you plan for the full rollout of the new process and system across the various VUs? So Phil, do you want to share that that view across LKQ Europe? What's your kind of overall plan? You're in the midst of it. What's your plan?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at two strands here, Dan. So the ERP rollout is probably going to be a 3-4 year project. and the process improvement will be executed in advance of that. So it's certainly going to take a couple of years, a good couple of years to get through that in its entirety from a process perspective, and then from an ERP perspective, you're probably a 3 to 4 year journey.
Yeah, makes sense. Thanks, Phil. And here's another question, which is more about the human element: is how do you convince management that you needed to decide and align on the process first before driving the system implementation? Because you mentioned a little touch on the system implementation early on. How do you manage to make your approach was right?
I think this was, pretty much self-evident, as we talked about the current landscape of IT that we have with 20 plus ERPs. As we're moving from one geography to the next, it was becoming very clear that we were simply replicating that, or we would replicate that if we carried on the journey without making some changes. So the identification that, hey, we need one way of working, it really came out through our experience of the ERP rollout.
Right, thank you.
I don't think I can take credit for that one, I'm afraid.
No, but it is important that sometimes these things come from real hard-won experience. It's not just a philosophical belief. You realise that this isn't going to work if we carry on this way. And they are not unique in that. I mean, I have a number of folks I know in big companies around the world who've done a massive systems implementation and actually said afterwards, you know what, the new problems are still the old problems, and we've got a different interface, but nothing's changed. So it's, that makes a lot of sense. I've got one final question for you, because I'm going to try and keep it within 15% overrun.
I'll try and keep the answer short.
To do with all of the subject matter experts and the business units you're operating with, 20 or 21 operating units across Europe. How did you manage getting their input to process change whilst they've got a day job? Because they're busy running and doing the business, right? And you're talking about the way it's going to be.
Yeah. Hey, look, that's a challenge every day. Initially we positioned the project at a C level, both at Europe and then at the C level within the regions, to say, this is the rationale, this is the reason why we need to do this, we need everyone to get on board. And really, this is the ask that we have from the regions in order to support this. And the C level then identified individuals within their regions that had the required skill set. And each region approached that task differently. So it's something we are acutely mindful of as we're going through this journey, that from a regional perspective, when we're drawing on their time, it's not a standing army that we can draw upon. These people do have busy day jobs, and they deserve a lot of credit for being able to juggle the competing agendas that they have.
And I guess they must ask themselves, what's in it for me? I'm measured on the stuff I'm doing today, and I'm being asked to contribute to something we might do tomorrow.
Very much so, and that's the belief in there is a better way of working, and that's why you're committing this time.
Right. Well, thank you, Phil. It's been great. We have overrun, but I said we might. But I thank you so much for your time. I hope you found it useful. This is somebody in the midst of this journey, sort of fighting all the battles on all fronts. So thank you very much, Phil, for sharing that with us. Thank you all for joining us. As I say, if you've got any further questions, drop me an email. I'll discuss with Phil. We'll get back by email. Thank you all, and see you next time. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.